So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged. As I'm sure you can see, this is not going to be a battle replay, and interestingly enough, this little thing down in the bottom corner is not entirely correct either, because this is going to be a look at some of the things that are going to be added in 0.97, because up until now I've been a little bit reluctant to sort of start covering things, because obviously it is a work in progress, but with sort of a few of the new additions lately, new units, a whole new faction, and a few new maps as well, I figured it was time to start shedding some light on this, particularly seeing as the upcoming tournament, which is going to be hosted in just a few days, is going to take place on the 0.97 test build. So some of the videos that you're going to be seeing are going to be sort of within 0.97. In addition to the sort of, well, I've also been given a couple of replays that I'm going to be doing on the test build as well, so you're going to be seeing a bit more 0.97 from now on. At least that is the intention, provided that I can keep the replays flowing. So I think what we're going to do first of all is we're going to take a look at the new units for the existing factions. Then we'll be taking a look at the new faction, which is of course Nmenor, as I'm sure that most people who follow Reforged will already be aware of. And then following on from that, the video after this one will be a replay battle on 0.97. So let's dive right in. So we're going to be starting off with Dol Amroth. Now obviously Gondor is technically ahead of them in the list, but Gondor don't actually have any new units because they have always had a rather extensive roster, and also some of the mechanical changes, which we'll go into at a later date, have affected Gondor more than most. I mean, you know, their focus around spears and the changes to spears in particular is something which has shimmied Gondor's balancing around a little bit. But Dol Amroth in the last patch, as people sort of played it, became a little bit more apparent that Dol Amroth were a little bit lacking compared to some of the other kingdoms of men, particularly those of a similar type, so factions like Arthedain or Gondor, who have sort of a similar structure to them. Dol Amroth were a little bit further behind them, because while they were certainly strong, particularly in their cavalry department, there was, you know, they just seemed to be a little bit underwhelming to play as when you compared them. So a few things have been added to them in this in 0.97 to try and make up for that. And the first is going to be a unit of infantry, the Champions of Cobas Haven, and just by looking at them you can tell that they are a human swordmaster unit. So this is a unit which is going to be in a similar vein to something like the dismounted Lothlorien Knights or the Caer Andros Swordmasters or the Abrazani Narduzagar. They have a very similar price point at 850 and similar stats across the board. They have good total defense, but that mostly comes from their skill, as with other swordmaster units, and they also have good attack value, so they're going to be able to carve their way through lower tier units pretty effectively. You will need to support them, otherwise they will be overwhelmed. I mean, Dol Amroth still have that slightly more quality focused edge to them, but they look pretty fantastic, I must say. There's also a little bit more Nmenorian influence with these guys. You can see from their helms that they've got the sort of the Nmenorian helmet crest there. But in general, I think this is a good addition, because this was a pretty notable gap in Dol Amroth's roster previously. Obviously they did have the Haven Guard, which were fantastic sort of multiple HP sort of super tier units, but Dol Amroth never had a Swordmaster unit that was sort of, you were able to bring and use a little bit more freely, and that was pretty notable considering all the other kingdoms of men pretty much had it, except for Rohan, I believe. But moving on, Dol Amroth do have a pretty clear focus when it comes to their cavalry. And the first of these new units we're going to be taking a look at are the Peridhill Horse Guard, which near enough are, they're going to be melee cavalry. Obviously they have a bonus fighting cavalry, they're wielding swords, they have shields, and I think this is because they have had the Merc cavalry taken away, and obviously they're going to be better than mercenary cavalry anyway, so this is a real win. They are more expensive than Merc cavalry, it's worth saying as well though, and near enough you can look at them as being a sort of sword and board variant of the Swan Knights, which are still available obviously, and they still have their two-handed swords. A little bit more expensive, very dangerous obviously in a cavalry to cavalry engagement, but this is just another one of those units which is going to make Dol Amroth incredibly difficult to fight one-to-one in just a pure melee cavalry fight. In fact, arguably only Khand are going to be able to field more melee cavalry than Dol Amroth, and then there's also the Wargs to consider as well from the Orcs. But certainly if you're playing one of the other sort of cavalry-focused kingdoms of men, someone like Rohan or even Arthedain, you're going to want to be a little bit careful, I feel like, because Dol Amroth's melee cav contingent has certainly been increased in terms of its strength with the addition of these guys, and the fact that they still have their standard Swan Knights and their Haven Knights. However, Dol Amroth do also have a few other things going for them, and that is this new unit as well, the Aru of Dol Amroth. Now, obviously you can tell just based on the fact that they are a relatively small unit overall. I really like the new units for Dol Amroth as well, they look pretty sexy. But you can tell from the unit size and also the stats all around that these are a unit essentially of standard knights. You know, the Haven Knights in the past are sort of the melee variant, but sometimes it may be that you want to go a little bit more aggressive with your cavalry, have a higher charge bonus, really start tormenting that infantry. So this is going to be a unit more in the vein of the Knights of a Numinas, or the Carmel's Dragon Knights. So, you know, something along those lines. Obviously very nice armor values as well. Yeah, very, very nice unit. And this obviously does fill in another small gap that you could argue Dol Amroth had, because while the Haven Knights were good, they definitely had a different function to a lot of the other knights. So this certainly rounds out Dol Amroth's mounted knight contingents very nicely, and it certainly gives them the feeling of them being top of the tree when it comes to sort of their heavily armoured mounted cavalry. They also have another new unit, however, which this is a pretty significant one, because this was one of the really noticeable gaps that Dol Amroth had in 0.96, and that was the fact they had no ranged cavalry to speak of. That is no longer the case. They now have the Peridil Randirim, which are bow cavalry. They are horse archers, and just having a look at a cursory glance at some of their stats, their missile attack is 7, which is pretty decent, honestly. And their total defense values are not bad either. You can tell just from looking at them that they are a little bit more well armoured than some of the hordes from Khand, or even some of the basic Rohirrim archers. But you know, as far as horse archers go, they're never going to be doing a lot of damage super quickly unless they're mounted rangers. Definitely a good harassment tool, however, and this does prevent Dol Amroth's cavalry from simply being picked off from a distance by enemy horse archers. Now, it is obviously still going to be an area in which they are a little bit more thin on the ground than the likes of Arthedain or especially Rohan or Khand, but just the fact they have an option here now means that they aren't completely defenceless when it comes to getting their cavalry kited into oblivion. And of course, you know, now that they have horse archers, they can engage in standard horse archer tactics themselves. So a good addition, this, because I think it does close a real weakness that Dol Amroth held in 0.96. But all in all, this is a pretty good addition to Dol Amroth, I feel like. This certainly cements their position as one of the stronger cavalry-focused factions in the game. And obviously that addition of a swordmaster unit as well makes their infantry a little bit stronger, which their infantry was an area which they were a little bit lacking, perhaps, in 0.96 compared to some of their peers, but now, you know, they've got a little bit of reinforcement there as well. So now we shall move on. So I will also be covering units which have changed pretty significantly, and for Dale, you know, they may not have any all-new units, but the way that the Laketown Bowmen have been changed sort of shifts the dynamic of their faction quite a lot, to be honest with you, because they no longer have access to the Laketown Spearmen or Infantry, so you won't have access to those sort of low-tier, not quite fodder units, but definitely more expendable than your more expensive stuff. Because all of those units have essentially been rolled into this single unit of Laketown Bowmen. At least the Laketown Infantry have been combined with the Laketown Bowmen. So this essentially means they are a hybrid unit now between sort of very standard archers and very standard line infantry. So this, I feel as though this is going to be a central pillar of a lot of what Dale tried to do, because this is going to make, obviously, fielding a lot of basic archers very easy for them. They have a shield value, so skirmishing with them is going to be less attractive a proposition than it was in the past, and even in the past they weren't exactly the easiest to skirmish with because of how many of them there were. I'm losing my voice, I'm sorry about that. But I feel as though this is a very important, because even in melee they're not going to be super good still. You know, the Laketown Infantry were never exactly world beaters in melee, but they were at least infantry that could hold the line for a time, whereas in melee previously the Laketown Bowmen would capitulate very, very quickly. But just combining these two units gives a new dimension to Dale, because this means they are essentially going to be able to bring a pretty hefty skirmish line no matter what they do, really, because even if they just bring the Laketown Bowmen, they're obviously going to have that hybridization between their missiles and their melee capabilities, or they could completely forego that and go for a more quality approach and sort of spend their money elsewhere rather than spending it on a bunch of Laketown units at the front which they no longer have access to. They still do have the Laketown Pikemen, to be fair, which obviously is a pretty significant thing, because cheap pikes can be very, very handy indeed. But yeah, I'm interested to see how Dale go in the new patch, because Dale, I think, were quite underutilised in 0.96 as it went along. I didn't really see a great deal of them, and I feel as though that's because they weren't quite in the same boat as Dol Amroth, where they weren't effective at all, but they were really pigeonholed into being playing a very specific way, with obviously very hefty skirmish presence and a phalanx. But Arthedain did all of that whilst having a very strong cavalry line as well, which allowed them to be both defensive and aggressive in a situation, whereas Dale really didn't have that. The Dalian cavalry were good lancers, but they were quite vulnerable. The Earls were fairly slow and intended to be used defensively, you feel. But even, just with this simple change of sort of shifting the dynamic of their lower tier units, giving Dale sort of the guarantee of having a good skirmish line on the field that they don't necessarily have to babysit quite so much, shifts things a good bit, I think, and I'll be interested to see how Dale get along in the coming patch. So Arthedain are in the same boat as Dale, really, in that they don't have any all-new stuff, but they have had some of their units changed considerably, and this mainly pertains to their Dunedain units, actually their melee Dunedain in particular, starting off with the Peacekeepers here, which, the picture up here may show them still with their spears, but you will see that they now have axes instead, so they have changed from spearmen to essentially line infantry, although, axe and board rather than sword and board. Fairly expensive as well at 800. They are not AP as one-handed axes used to be, but they have a decent attack bonus at 14, and obviously as Dunedain their defensive skill is pretty decent as well. So this, essentially I feel as though this was a necessary change because the Dunedain Peacekeepers made it so that no one ever brought the Fornoster defenders as spearmen, so one of the two units needed to sort of change and make way a little bit. And the obvious choice was the Peacekeepers, because you could change them into a different kind of infantry unit, different kind of Dunedain unit, while keeping the Fornoster defenders being sort of stock spearmen. And this is actually an interesting addition to Arthedain, because a lot of the time I see Arthedain's infantry used very defensively, and sort of their aggressive nature is sort of meted out in their archers and their cavalry, which I still feel as though is going to be the case, honestly, with Arthedain, because that's where most of their more obvious strengths lie. But the Dunedain Peacekeepers do offer them a fairly safe bet of scoring some decent damage in melee as well. Like, there are going to be very few sort of more basic units that are going to want to take the Dunedain Peacekeepers head on with an attack value of 14, which is significant. It's a sort of attack value you would expect to see on a unit that foregoes a shield and goes two-handed instead. So interesting addition this. I'll be interested to see how people use them, because the Peacekeepers, the spear variant, were used they were used a lot of the time for Arthedain in the previous patch, but I'm interested to see how the axe and shield variant goes. I really like the aesthetic of the Dunedain units in general, and I like the axe and shield combo. It's working for me. Meanwhile, the other Dunedain unit that we're going to be speaking about has also lost their spear, because the Dunedain Mounted Company are now no longer lancers; they are melee cavalry. And this, rather like how Dol Amroth, a lot of their new units were added to sort of close gaps in their army. This is also very similar, because Arthedain now have a melee cavalry unit where they had none before. So from now on, it's no longer going to be all on the Knights of Numenor to provide an anti-cavalry bonus in melee with other cavalry. Arthedain can now use their cavalry much more defensively, potentially, or just mix the Mounted Company in with their still very present and very dangerous Lance Cavalry to make a very potent combination, I feel. And obviously, as Dunedain, good total defense. The defensive skill is a significant thing here, because if you remember the Dol Amroth stats, they were a little bit more about their armour rather than their skill. This is the opposite. But even so, melee cavalry, it's very one note as a unit goes. I mean, you can charge them in, but their charge bonus is pretty pitiful at 4. So most of the time you're going to be seeing these guys do all of their damage in melee, and this is a significant addition to Arthedain. Makes them significantly more well-rounded and gives their cavalry even more of an edge than it already had. Now this is a unit which hasn't necessarily changed in any way. This is the Royal Court of House Armlaith, and generally speaking it's still the same sort of thing. It is a multiple HP Lance Cavalry unit, so its function is the same, but as you can see, the unit model has changed significantly. So now no longer is it essentially just it looked exactly the same as the Fornoster Knights in the previous patch. It was very difficult to tell them apart. That will no longer be the case. The Royal Court of House Armlaith now look a lot more like their station suggests. So they've been given a nice new coat of paint. So after a fair few factions which hadn't really had any changes, at least none that would be significant enough to mention, factions like Cardolan, Rudawa, Mordor and Isengard, we come to the Misty Mountains, and I think this is probably the first example of a returning unit. Once upon a time the Mountaineric Blades were in the Misty Mountains, and then they were taken out, and now they're back again. So not too much to talk about with the Mountaineric Blades, to be honest with you. They are essentially a standard line infantry unit that are higher in quality than the Heavy Goblin Infantry. Although at 600 you do need to bear in mind that they still aren't going to be able to move mountains for you. They'll last slightly longer than the heavy goblins in melee. But still, there is a limit to what they can accomplish. But it gives the Misty Mountains an option here in sort of the mid-tier, at least as far as orcs goes, because previously the Misty Mountains were kind of stuck with having just a ton of goblins and then a few elite units, particularly some trolls, which would do things for them. But now, you know, potentially a little bit more room for maneuver here, a little bit potentially a higher quality goblin line that's going to be coming towards you with some Nmenor blades mixed in, but even so, it's a more of a minor addition, I think, this for the Misty Mountains. Certainly more minor than this anyway, which I'm sure most of you have seen at this point. This is of course the Mangonel, which many of you who have played any of the Medieval 2 in the past will recognise the Mangonel. The Mangonel is an interesting piece of siege equipment. I feel as though the only way to really explain what it does is to see it in action, and there have been videos posted on it previously. But the main factor of it is that it's going to cause panic in the enemy army. As soon as the Mangonel projectiles hit, they tank the morale of the units that are coming towards them. And honestly, the amount of damage it does can be fairly limited, but the morale shocks that it causes are never really limited. It's going to be, particularly if you're facing off against another orc faction, where hitting them is going to be easier with the bigger surface area that their armies tend to cover, and the fact they have lower morale in general, the Mangonel could do some serious damage to that sort of approach. I'd be interested to see how the creative ways in which people use the Mangonel, because obviously, rather like Isengard with their unique ballista, this is a piece of siege equipment which is completely unique to the Misty Mountains, so any strategies that are developed around this piece of siege equipment are going to be unique to the Misty Mountains as a faction. So yeah, I'm interested to see how this develops. I'll be interested to see if any more pieces of siege equipment in the future make it in as sort of unique to factions, because there seems to be a precedent for that now. Yeah, Mangonel crew, inaccurate but deadly, is probably the best description you can make of it, to be honest. So now we come to Unbar, and they have a solitary new unit which we'll actually be seeing more of a little bit later. So I think we'll save a lot of what I've got to talk about with well, there's not much to talk about with these guys anyway, to be honest with you, as far as their functionality goes at any rate, because they are essentially melee knights. You can see their total defense value is very high, attack is good, but you know, their charge is a little bit weaker than the standard knights. So yeah, Unbar now have a melee knight unit, which is expensive, but obviously this is going to give them a little bit more muscle in a cavalry to cavalry fight, where again, a lot of the time you would be reliant on your warlords of Unbar sort of pulling you out of the fighter there. It is possible, of course, that now both Dol Amroth and Unbar could bring a unit of lance knights and a unit of melee knights to the field, which is a potent combination, but is also going to be extremely expensive, with both of these knight units costing an awful lot. Not a lot of men in the unit anyway, not a lot of unit in the men, I was about to say, but obviously, you know, fantastic looking units as well. I've always liked Unbar's style, I must say. Nice helms, obviously the Nmenorian shields as well with the long swords. There's also this lad here who's in gold armour, so very in keeping with our Pharazon style. Yeah, this is the only new unit for Unbar, and we will be seeing them again because they are also a part of Nmenor, so we'll be speaking about them again post haste. So now we come to Lothlorien, and actually a note on all the elves. I have noticed that a lot of the names across the mod have changed, but the elves have as well, and it's for the better from my point of view, because no longer will I have to try and say Maethir Elaz Gellan, because for Lothlorien it's now simply called the Inner Council. I'm very pleased with that, because obviously the elves their naming was always a little bit more difficult to get through, even more so than Unbar actually for me, interestingly enough. But Lothlorien do have an all-new unit. Now this does come at the expense of the Lothlorien blades from the last patch, which were of course sort of higher tier sword and board units, but they also clashed a little bit with the Lothlorien axes. Really there was no need for both of them. So they were removed, and a unit of basic sword and board units were added to Lothlorien instead, so something similar to the Eldar Makar, or maybe the Megil-e Erin from Mirkwood would be a better analogy to use for them. So obviously the Lorien sentries. Overall, their skill is going to be what sees them through. Most of these basic elven units tend to have pretty low armour, so that is worth bearing in mind. They also have 2 levels of armour upgrades, so the first is going to be this, and the second is going to be this, although I think they look pretty much the same, the 2 levels of armour upgrades, although it's very possible, of course, that this will turn into the unit model that was used for the Lothlorien blades previously. This is still obviously a work in progress. But yeah, this gives Lothlorien another interesting dynamic, because previously Lothlorien were the only ones that couldn't field a sort of more reasonably priced line of infantry. You know, they had to be completely reliant on their Sylvan spears instead, which with the spear malices made them a little bit less effective at that sort of thing, and so they had to be a little bit more risky with their picks. Usually they had to spend a lot more on their units on the front line than the other elves potentially had to, which, you know, is not always the sort of thing you want to do. They of course still can do that with units like the Lothlorien axes and the blade masters and such. But yeah, I feel like this is a good addition. Again, it's just one of those units which closes a hole that Lothlorien had that the other elves did not. So for Mirkwood, the big boys are back. We have the Ents. Now the Ents have always kind of been a part of the game, although you had to go into custom scenarios and custom battles to utilise them, but now the Ents have been added to a faction properly, and that is going to be Mirkwood. Of course, as far as functionality goes, the closest thing that you can compare the Ents to would of course be the Trolls, in particular the stronger Trolls, stuff like the Olag High, which is designed a little bit more to be in sustained combat rather than stuff like the Cave Trolls or the Troll Drummers. And this gives Mirkwood, I think, you know, well, I know that the thinking behind giving Mirkwood the Ents was the fact that Mirkwood found it much more difficult to be aggressive than the other elves. Like Imladris obviously had their extreme defensive values, and obviously their very strong infantry. Linden had just all of their hybrid units, and the fact that, you know, their units tended to gel very well together regardless of what you brought. And then Lothlorien obviously, you know, with their aggressive units were able to compensate a little bit perhaps for some of the natural weaknesses of the elves, so obviously being overwhelmed more easily. But Mirkwood, a little bit less so. A lot of that does come down to the fact that Mirkwood are just naturally a little bit more focused around their archer companies, so they had more archer units than the others, and obviously that cut into their infantry a little bit as well. But now they have the ability to be more aggressive with the Ents, and I would be interested to see what compositions people will come up with Mirkwood now that you can bring the Ents, because obviously this is going to change the dynamic pretty significantly. If you see you can no longer expect Mirkwood to just be all about their archers, because if you try and go into it thinking that's alright, we'll just try and match up with their archers, try and wear them down, and they bring Ents, that's going to be a real problem, because your archers are not going to be able to defend themselves from a bunch of marauding Ents. So yeah, I think it's good that the Ents are finally in the game. Obviously back in vanilla they would cause horrendous crashing. Let's hope that's not the case now, although to be fair, Reforged more recently has certainly been a lot more stable. So yeah, that's I'm glad to see the Ents in the game, to be honest with you. It's another one of those sort of very showstopper units that you can sort of look at, similar to something like the Mumakil or the Trolls, that really catch the eye during a battle. Now we move on to Khazad-dûm, and to a unit which I'm sure is not going to be actually called Durin's Bane, because that's a very strange name indeed. But it is a crossbow unit, and it's a significantly powerful crossbow unit as well. Crossbows was something which Khazad-dûm completely lacked in the previous patch, and with how powerful Khazad-dûm are, I'm sure that some people are concerned that giving them a crossbow unit simply adds to their power. But of course, Khazad-dûm's infantry and stuff like their 4th Legion and all of that stuff will be toned down in 0.97, and it might be the case that it was toned down enough to the point where Khazad-dûm needed a little something else potentially to bring to the battlefield to keep their opponents guessing, and this would be it, I assume. And based on the name, I can only assume that they are intended to be Balrog hunters, especially seeing as their weaponry seems to be rather heavy duty, almost like handheld ballista, more so than a crossbow. So basically I would say that the Blackhawk Engineers are the unit that you can look at as the Durin's Bane being similar to. And, you know, it is only a singular unit, so they're not going to be able to bring as many crossbows as Erebor. So obviously the identity of Erebor is somewhat safe from that perspective, and obviously other factions like Cardalin and Isengard will still be able to bring more crossbows than Khazad-dûm. But even so, as far as a single unit goes, I can imagine these guys being incredibly powerful in a siege if you can situate them in the right place, just like the Blackhawk Engineers are. Yeah, again, it's a unit that I feel as though I'd be interested to see in action before any judgment can be passed on them, but certainly as far as concept goes, and as far as style goes, you know, I feel as though this can only be a good thing for Khazad-dûm. So, with all of the new stuff for the existing factions out of the way, the time has come to get our teeth into the new faction, which is of course Nmenor, which, up until the point when it was apparent that it was almost finished, I wasn't actually aware that Nmenor was going to be a new faction, so this was certainly a pleasant surprise. And as far as the overall focus of Nmenor goes, well, in J Monster's words, they would be high risk, high reward. So they have less numbers than pretty much every other, well, definitely less numbers than any other kingdom of men. You know, they would be much more like the elves in terms of their overall numbers. And overall, I would say that, you know, they probably have the strengths of both the kingdoms of men, sort of stuff like Arthedain, and the elves, but they also seemingly have the weaknesses of both as well. So obviously, you know, they can't rely fully on the fact that all of their units are going to be super skillful like the elves, but neither will they be able to rely on their numbers like the kingdoms of men can, a little bit more so. But, you know, they do have some of the good points of both as well. We'll start off with the siege, because obviously that's going to be no different to any other faction. They do have the trebuchet, of course, like all of the other Nmenorian factions, as you would expect from Nmenor. So obviously they share that with Gondor, Arthedain, and a few others. They also have a ballista, although the ballista crew is currently invisible. Interesting. No catapult, interestingly enough, although this is a work in progress, I should hasten to add, so it's very possible that this stuff will change moving forwards. Now, however, we'll get into the meat of their army, and the one thing that's worth noting about Nmenor is they essentially seem to be a sort of an amalgamation of Arthedain, Unbar, and Mordor, interestingly enough. So you'll see some familiar things from those factions, starting off with the Romana Sentinels, which are, of course, essentially slightly different, slightly cleaner looking, as we said, versions of the Arthedain pikemen. But in terms of overall, in terms of their stats, they are stronger, actually, looking at their stats. You know, this is something that you would expect from Nmenor overall, especially seeing as you're going to have significantly smaller armies. You would expect even their basic units to be pretty strong, and of course even the Romana Sentinels, which technically speaking their basic pike unit costs 775, so obviously even here the high risk, high reward nature of Nmenor is starting to show itself. And then over here, of course, we have the armour upgrade, which gives them their full plate, which is going to make them just that little bit tankier. And again, you know, a pike unit that costs 775 is going to put these guys in the same sort of ballpark as units like the Mithlond pikemen from Linden. You know, not quite as high up there as stuff like the 1st Legion from Khazad-dûm, but it's getting up there, and this is only the first unit that we're seeing for Nmenor, remember, so that is worth bearing in mind moving forward. Moving along, we have another unit which I'm liking the look of as well, the Alchemist Legion, which, you know, they will look very similar because they have the same sort of look as the Castamir's Legion from Unbar. And as a unit, in terms of functionality, they are going to be very similar as well. 850 makes them pretty expensive, but as line infantry goes, they're going to be able to outclass an awful lot of what comes up against them. I'd be interested to see just sort of where on the pecking order they are. I would assume they're probably going to be stronger than stuff like the Guardians of Kharn-dûm. They're probably going to be right in there with the Castamir's Legion as well. Probably not quite as strong as something like the Imladris Guardians from Imladris, but even so, I mean, this is still going to give Nmenor a very, very strong front line in terms of just overall quality. Numbers are obviously going to be something which Nmenor are going to lack pretty much universally when comparing them to other factions. So obviously, whereas most other factions, line infantry, you know, humans are going to have something like 160 per unit, orcs are going to have upwards of 200, but Nmenor very much focused around their quality. So definitely making sure that you don't get overwhelmed is going to be the primary challenge, I feel like, with Nmenor, particularly on an open field. But obviously, you know, I'm liking the look of the Alchemist Legion an awful lot. And then over here, back to the Arthedain style, almost, we have the Elonde Swordmasters, which of course, you know, very similar to the Fornost Arraign Knights, only, again, a little bit cleaner, a little bit nicer looking, it must be said. And again, 900, so this again is going to be very similar to other human Swordmaster units, although I would probably say, based on the cost and based on some of these stats, that they would be slightly stronger than the vast majority of the other human Swordmasters. Again, only 103 of them per unit, so you do have to look after them. Again, that's going to be the primary thing here with Nmenor. You are, you know, putting a foot wrong, you're going to be punished with Nmenor, because a lot of these units are very expensive and can find themselves wiped out very quickly if you accidentally send them into the wrong area, whether that's by ranged units, by cavalry, or simply being overwhelmed. But again, overall, the stats on these guys are very, very high, so 1-to-1, they're going to be very difficult customers to bring down. Then moving on, again, now we're moving over to, again, the Unbar style, and also a little bit of the Mordor style as well, the Numenorian Shield Guard. Obviously, we are in Numenor now, so it makes sense that they make their presence felt here as well. Although here, I believe they are just the same unit as they are in both Unbar and Mordor, so there's no sort of special variant for Numenor themselves. But again, they are very effective spears, and of course the changes to spears means that cavalry is going to want to steer well clear of the Numenorian shield guard. So again, I mean, looking at things, this is technically speaking the closest thing that Numenor have to a basic spear unit. So it definitely sort of lays out their intent pretty clearly when sort of hyper elite, well not hyper elite, but very elite spearmen from other factions are sort of like the bread and butter of Numenor. Meanwhile, moving on, again, another Unbar style unit, we have the Aru Sentinels, which are of course one of the finest pike units in the game. They have that slight shield value, which certainly helps mitigate some arrow fire, nice armour values as well. Obviously, again, as far as pikes go, they're going to be able to sit in formation and very happily hold off vast quantities of enemy forces. But again, they're not multiple HP, so that is worth saying it again. If their phalanx gets disrupted, that's going to be when they're sort of at their weakest, but then that's the case for pretty much all of the most elite pikes, other than, of course, the Karas Kaladon's Guardians, which can mitigate that a little bit more than the others, but yeah, very, very strong. And now for a unit which is more or less, actually, obviously in terms of style, they are basically brass armour variants of the Harbingers of Castamere, without the horns though. But they are a sword and board variant, and obviously this is the Royal Legion of Armenelos. Obviously 1300, so again, multiple HP sword and board unit. The stats on these guys are actually extremely high, sort of up there, surpassing even the likes of the Wardens of the White Tower, I think, with how strong they are. But again, this does make a certain amount of sense. If Numenor are sort of putting all of their eggs into the quality basket, they are going to need units like this to be stronger than their counterparts from other cities, other factions. I was reading this then, the Golden City. That's obviously very nice armour, very nice looking unit as well. I have to say that the Numenor style, just in general, is going to be a big draw for people, I feel like. But again, Numenor, just from a cursory glance at what their sort of strengths and weaknesses are, I feel like they're going to be one of the harder factions to play as, so that is worth bearing in mind. And then finally, a unit which I'm sure people will be, well, in terms of style here, maybe not immediately apparent, the Temple Executioners, which are obviously a unit that they are going to be sharing with Mordor. So obviously we know full well how dangerous the Temple Executioners can be, and again, it's not too surprising that Numenor are going to have a unit of such quality at the heart of things. Obviously 1-to-1, it's going to be very difficult to bring down a unit like the Temple Executioners. Late game in a siege, if you see these guys marching forward and they're still fresh and your army is on its last legs, that's often the final nail in the coffin. And obviously this is going to round out the pure infantry units of Numenor, and obviously they look pretty fantastic as well. Obviously they're differentiated a little bit from the Mordor by having these brighter colours. So now we shall move on to the missile units that Nmenor have available to them. I almost called them Arthedain then. Starting off with the Rowena Marines, which are, as the name suggests, marine units. So similar to the Belfalas Marines, the Pelagia Marines, or even the Forlinden Marines, they are javelin units. And more so similar to Linden, I feel like, because they also sort of double as pretty decent line infantry when all is said and done. So they are certainly hybrid units between javelins and line infantry. So actually no, wait, hybrids between javelins and spears? No, they've got swords in their little portrait, but still they have a bonus fighting cavalry, effective against armour. They do cost 750 though, so this is very, very Linden-esque. In fact, it might even be better to compare them to the Mithlond Marines, more so than anything else, and obviously they do have the same armour upgrade that their pike brethren have as well. So obviously, making them look nicer, but also increasing their survivability, which is going to be important, because enemy archers are probably going to want to shower down javelins from a distance before they get into range and start doing damage. 8 armor-piercing damage is pretty good as well. So, yeah, obviously javelins in general can be very, very deadly. And then over here, we have, again, sort of very similar to the Arthedain marksman, we have the Romana marksman, which in terms of missile attack have got 6 rather than 5. So again, it just goes to show that Numenor have more in common with the elves than the other factions have, because again they have a lot of stats which are more reminiscent of that sort of thing. But they also combine it with the armour from the Kingdoms of Men, but as I said, they tend to lack some of the safety nets that the elves have, at least on a cursory glance anyway. I've never played as Numenor, so I can't really speak with too much authority on this. But again, this is a basic unit of archers and they cost 800, so it just goes to show that your armies are going to be smaller, than your opponents in the vast majority of cases, even in the elves in some cases. I would say that Linden can fairly easily field a bigger army than Nmenor, based on the pricing of some of these units. And obviously, once again, we have the same armor upgrade over here, so obviously, again, very strong. Decent in melee by the looks of things as well. Their total defense values means they're not going to be able to be chewed through all that easily. They also have a shield value, so a shield value of 4. So again, a good hybrid unit here. And then we have the Numenorian Shadow Guard. So again, this is a unit that we've seen before, and these are going to be the Rangers of Numenor. So again, as far as Rangers go, they aren't actually, they don't actually stand out all that much more next to their compatriots. They have a missile attack of 5, so this is an area in which they actually borrow from the Kingdoms of Men more so than the Elves. Elven Rangers have 6 missile damage, whereas humans have 5. But their total defense values, total skill, overall, they're still... Rangers in general, we all know how dangerous Rangers can be, and the Numenorian Shadow Guard will be no different there. The Temple Executioners are here, and that of course means that the Temple Guard are here as well, which means an armor-piercing archer for Numenor. Obviously, stylistically, they are very different to the Mordor variant, but in terms of overall functionality, they are going to be pretty much the same thing, I would imagine. As far as their melee attack and their total defense goes, obviously you pay quite a lot for an armor-piercing archer. And also with Numenor, I feel as though they are going to have a few more issues actually defending it, especially than Dale and Mordor, who have got plenty of disposable stuff that they can put in front of their Blackshot Dragon Slayers and Temple Guard. Numenor will probably not have that luxury, but even so, this is going to be another tool that they can potentially use. And then finally, we have another unit from the Unbar side of things, the Aru Royal Guard, which again I believe are just, in terms of stats, pretty much the same thing. Obviously they are hybrids between multiple HP archers and multiple HP spearmen, and with the changes to spears, this is going to make it a pretty safe place to put your general overall, because if cavalry charges into them, they may find themselves taking a lot more damage than they bargained for. Obviously again, I've always liked the Unbar style of things, so the fact that this is bled across into Numenor pleases me, and also, just in general, I feel as though the unit models have just been touched up a little bit, and that's also very nice. So now we move on to the cavalry wing of Numenor, which is fairly small, but again, in a similar vein to Linden's, I would imagine that bound up in these very few units, we have a lot of functionality, and we start off, of course, with the Numenorian Lancers, which are Lance Cavalry. Obviously they cost 1,000, which is quite a lot. Charge bonus of 15, so not the full charge bonus of 20, but that is still armor piercing. And obviously overall the Numenorian Lancers also have a decent amount of skill and armour to make it so that they would survive where lesser Lancers would fall apart more quickly. But the Numenorian Lancers overall are still going to be the same sort of thing that you see from both Mordor and Unbar. And then we shall move on to the 2 all-new units, starting off with the Elonde Nobles, which, looking at things here, would appear to be melee cavalry of a type. They've got, definitely melee cavalry. They've got bonus fighting cavalry, excellent morale, but it's interesting because they also have another cavalry unit which would seem to fulfill very similar functionality, but even so, enemy cavalry is not going to want to linger too long in melee with the Elonde Nobles with stats like this. Bonus fighting cavalry, decent attack values, but in particular the defense values, which are going to be fairly significant. And then finally, of course, the unit that we've already seen, which are Meg Lane Knights, and again, it's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit confused, because both of these units seem to be doing pretty much the same sort of task, only the Elonde Nobles have got a few more men in the unit, but the Alcandras Faithful, of course, as Knights, have got the highest stats. So Melee Knights, Alcandras Faithful, we've already seen them in the Unbar roster, and again, going to be the same sort of thing here. Very, very powerful in melee, but again, a very limited cav roster. Of course, we've already seen them. I feel as though, in terms of style, Numenor is going to win a lot of fans. It's more like we're Second Age Total War at this point than Third Age. But yeah, I feel as though Numenor do have some pretty substantial weaknesses here. They have very strong strengths, but very weak weaknesses would be the takeaway from this, I feel as like. So definitely the high risk, high reward sort of nature of them is fairly apparent. But I feel as though in sieges as well, particularly on defensive sieges, they could be a real handful to deal with how they don't really have any low quality units. So straight away you're going to have to deal with strong defenses. On the open field, they do have strong cavalry units individually, but fielding an extensive cavalry force is going to be next to impossible. So I feel as though they could be overwhelmed, especially by the likes of Rohan, Khan, even Dol Amroth. Now that they've got a few more options, but you know, again, individual quality over sort of the quantity of the entire army is definitely the name of the game here. So yeah, that was a look at Nmenor and all of the new units that are going to be added in 0.97. So naturally, all of this that you've seen today is a work in progress, so this is all of course subject to change, but I figured as though that now is the right time to start looking a little bit more at 0.97 now that we get ever closer to release, and of course the fact that the tournament is right around the corner as well. You know, it makes sense, I feel, as like to start covering this. So the next battle that we will be seeing will actually be one that was sent to me by J Monster. It is going to be a battle on 0.97 on one of the maps, which I believe was created for the tournament, but will of course be sort of bundled as part of 0.97 when it is released to the public. So yeah, I hope you will join me for that, and I hope you enjoyed this and found it somewhat informative. And I hope you enjoyed having a look at all of the work that has been put in to the upcoming patch. So yeah,